These rugged hills in North Wales saw the birth of a radical global transport technology. Narrow gauge railways.
How did these little Welsh trains ever end up having such a massive global impact? The mountains of North Wales are full of slate, and when the Industrial Revolution hit, the demand for Welsh slate exploded. New towns were being rapidly built around the country, and the thousands of new workers all needed a roof over their heads.
Now previously, when you wanted to roof your house, you'd use whatever was to hand. Stone, wood, reeds, straw. But this is the perfect roofing material for the expanding industrial towns. The problem is, how do you get this heavy, cumbersome material from up here down to the port? Right down there.
And the Welsh had solved the problem by building a transport system.
But quite early on, people started using rails in order to draw tubs full of coal along. And these developed into quite complicated horse-drawn mineral railways.
Rails were first laid through the mountains of North Wales in 1833. They were just wide enough apart for a horse to walk between them. They curved their way along a 13-mile route from the high point at Festiniog down to the harbour at Porthmadog.
The horse would draw a line of carriages uphill, and then they'd come back down on gravity with the horse riding in a dandy cart behind. And the brakeman would stand on top, and using these brake levers, he'd control the descent.
The horse-drawn Festiniog line could shift 18,000 tonnes of slate a year. But when the demand for roofing material rocketed, that was nowhere near enough. They needed something more powerful than horses to pull the crates up to the quarries. And the answer was steam power. Across Britain, by the 1850s, massive steam locomotives were hauling goods faster and in bigger quantities than ever before. If the transport of slate from the Welsh hills was to keep up with the times, they were going to have to change from using real horses to iron ones.
But there's a problem. The whole system works on this little gauge, 2 foot. Now that's really, really practical when you're in a constricted situation, in a mine, in a quarry. If the curves are tighter, you can carry the rails by hand. It's much, much simpler. It's a really brilliant economy of scale here, especially in the engineering. But the rest of the national system is working on a gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches, another 2 foot 8.5 inches wide. So, if you expand your narrow system to meet demand and carry more slate, you have to re-engineer the whole thing.
The cuttings, tunnels and bridges along the route would have all had to be widened to fit a standard-sized engine. The construction costs would have crippled the Festiniog line.
But there's another idea. Why not make a steam engine that runs on a narrow gauge? A little engine. Bless.
And that's just what they did. To fit the existing small lines running down the mountains, they built small locomotives. The little scaled-down versions of the mainline engines, the like of which had never been seen before, first steamed along the Festiniog line in 1863.
Some people call these toy trains, but they couldn't be more wrong. This isn't some miniature aberration. This is a brilliant technical solution to some very, very difficult engineering problems.
These little steam engines running on the Festiniog line could transport over 5 times the tonnage the horse-powered trains could handle. The small locomotives were a perfect solution. They brought steam power to the mountains without the need to change the line built for the horse-drawn carts. Steam power quickly spread through the Welsh hills, with small trains soon puffing along high up on the flanks of Snowdon.
The quarrymen started to build their railways up here. They bring their little steam engines up the inclines and run them actually in the quarries. And you can still see evidence of that today. Look, rails.
The small engines were a fraction of the weight of a standard gauge loco. And because they were so light, they could be easily hauled up the mountain to the quarry face. The rails were also much lighter and could be quickly laid to the next blasting point in the quarry. It was highly adaptable steam power on a small scale, and it revolutionised life in the mountains.
And this is one of the little engines that worked in the quarry behind us. These engines were bodily taken up to the top of the quarry on the inclined planes and worked right at the highest gallery levels, 1,750 feet above sea level. They are little, small. It's about 3,000 pounds tractive effort, which is about 10% of a mainline steam locomotive. But the increasing power over horse-drawn transport was radical.
At its peak here in North Wales, there were 18,000 people employed in the slate industry, and Welsh slate roofed the world. Thomas Bach, which means Little Thomas in Welsh, was only brought down from the quarries above Llanberis when the mines were finally closed. Today, many of the little quarry engines are still going strong, and having retired from pulling slate, are now pulling tourists. Back in 1869, the Festiniog line, which had pioneered the little trains, was proving incredibly popular. More slate was being moved than ever before, and passengers had begun to use it in droves.
But the Festiniog became a victim of its own success. With the booming slate traffic and passenger travel, the little engines just didn't have enough power.
The Festiniog Railway was granted the right to build a new second line to run parallel alongside the first to deal with the rise in traffic. But the engineering work needed to widen the track bed to take two lines next to each other would have been immense. The only other way of matching the demand was to build a more powerful engine that could run on the existing line. One that could pull longer trains, but yet still manoeuvre the tight bends.
The Festiniog Railway came up with a cutting-edge technological solution. One little engine, two little engines. Robert Francis Fairley's patent.
Robert Francis Fairley was a flamboyant Scotsman who, on hearing about the Festiniog's problem, came up with his novel design. The beauty of Fairley's creation was that here was a loco that could pull a much longer, heavier train, but could still manoeuvre over the tight curves of the narrow gauge route. The secret to the engine's manoeuvrability was in the wheels it sat on.
Fairley was a pioneer of articulation, standard practice now, but revolutionary then. This is a bogie. It contains pistons, the axles, and has a pivot point here. So, with a set of bogies at either end of the engine, they could move independently. So the wheels could face in opposite directions and go around very tight corners, at the same time having a much larger boiler on top, providing double the power through the two sets of pistons. It was then used in carriages and is standard practice now. But then it provided a breakthrough in power.
One boiler, two fireboxes and two bogies, each with two cylinders, giving you two power units.
Goes that way, goes that way. Twice the length, twice the boiler capacity, twice the power.
The double Fairley worked well for the Festiniog, It answered their problem. But Fairley was not one to keep his invention to himself. He was an outspoken self-publicist and attracted hundreds up to the hills of Wales to see his new creation.
Fairley was adamant that narrow gauge railways provided the best long-term solution for the carriage of freight and passengers in mountainous areas. His friends called him ambitious, articulate and untrammelled by modesty. Fairley's enthusiasm for the little railways provided the inspiration for the biggest narrow gauge network in the world.
Inspired engineering had started a narrow gauge revolution, and in the 1870s its influence spread to Colorado in the United States of America.
Mountain air. General William Palmer was a man with big ideas. He was a railwayman. He'd made plenty of money out east, but he was from Denver. The problem with Denver was that the railroad had bypassed it. He knew that Denver needed to turn from a village into a city. To do that, it needed a railroad. He wanted to build a 600-mile network of railways. Only trouble is, he had a small problem. The Rockies. But that didn't stop him continuing with his plans. And in order to fulfill his dream, he went to Wales.
For there he found mountains alive with trains, and characters like Robert Fairley, who were sure they had hit upon a system that could even conquer the Rockies.
Fairley was passionate enough about narrow gauge railways to convince Palmer that that was the solution to his problems, that he could use a narrow gauge railway, but that if he used powerful enough locomotives, it was a viable transport system for passengers and freight.
Palmer had struggled to get the full financial backing he needed before his Welsh trip. But by building a narrow gauge line, he could slash the cost of construction. Compared to building a normal sized track, everything could be done on a small scale. Lighter rails, narrower cuttings, tinier tunnels. Narrow gauge made his railway line through the mountains an economic possibility. It took him just 1 year after he returned from Wales to raise the cash he needed.
In 1871 he started building his line, the countryside that makes Wales look like a rockery. There was a lot of blasting and drilling, often done by men hanging over cliffs in baskets, being hauled out of the way just in time. No photographs were taken of the work in progress, so that none of Palmer's financiers could see what absolute madness they were paying for.
Palmer's Denver and Rio Grande network was built stretch by stretch. One of the sections that remains today, the 45-mile line from Durango to Silverton, was built in only 8 months. Quite an achievement, considering it was built at an altitude of over 7,200 feet in the middle of winter, with freezing temperatures and heavy snow to contend with. With the lines under construction, he turned his attention to finding a suitable locomotive.
Palmer borrowed his engineering model from Wales and his gauge, and it made sense to borrow his locomotive power, so he became the proud possessor of a double fairly articulated locomotive. But it didn't work for Palmer, although they worked in other places in the States.
Palmer's railroads covered long distances, and the trains had to keep running through really extreme conditions. The double fairly couldn't carry enough fuel for the long trips, and the open cab left the crews exposed.
So he turned to locomotives like this, a scaled-down version of standard gauge American locomotives, with all the same hallmarks. Huge lamp for working through adverse weather conditions. Great big spark arrestor chimney, because this one burnt wood. And then it's very open. There's incredibly easy access here. Then it has enclosed cab so crews didn't suffer in the awful weather in the mountains, and a great big tender to pull all the necessary supplies for a long distance narrow gauge line.
Palmer's railroad was soon reaching the small remote towns up in the hills. Towns that were sitting on seams of silver and gold. The name Silverton gives a clue to one of the reasons Palmer wanted to build the railway. There was money in them there hills. The new railroad worked both as a passenger line and for expanding the mining industry, bringing workers in and shipping the metal out.
Within 20 years, there were an incredible 12,000 miles of track in these mountains. A huge web that stretched out all over the hills.
Towns sprung up or expanded as the railroad network spread through the Rockies. Silverton boomed with the arrival of the line, and from its mines, trains shipped out over $300 million of precious metals. A town on the railroad was most certainly a town that could make money, something Palmer was very interested in.
Palmer's narrow gauge network made millions, especially for Palmer, who was a very shrewd operator. He knew that the most important thing about railways was the subsequent value of the land they passed through. He once asked the town of Pueblo to give him $150,000 to ensure that the railroad passed through their town. He did, but he also bought land on the other side of the river and built another town, South Pueblo. Cheers.
Palmer's transport network transformed life in the Rockies, and by the end of the 19th century, other rugged landscapes were beginning to be exploited. Countries such as New Zealand and South Africa were starting to build narrow gauge lines to move freight and passengers through hills. With more people involved, narrow gauge technology leapt ahead.
This, believe it or not, is a narrow gauge engine. This is a Garrett. It's an articulated engine like the Fairley, but it's another step forward. The boiler on this is as big as a standard gauge loco. It kicks out 83,500 pounds tractive effort. It's got 2 bogies, so it can go around incredibly sharp corners. This is the pinnacle of narrow gauge steam technology. And I'm on the footplate, thank you very much.
This brilliant locomotive is one of 2 Garrett engines running on the Welsh Highland Railway after finishing its working life in the wilds of the African continent.
These gauges are in 2 languages, English and Afrikaans. This Garrett's come a long way. South African Railways used over 400 of these on their narrow gauge system. It's quite warm on this footplate on account of one's proximity to the firebox, but just imagine what it would be like on this footplate in the deserts of Namibia. Warm work.
The Garrett engine is named after its inventor, William Garrett, a British inspecting engineer working out in Australia at the start of the 20th century. He designed his loco for the mountains of Tasmania, which desperately needed a train network, but had the sort of steep terrain that was a railway builder's nightmare. The line could only be 2 feet wide to get round the corners, but his engine was no miniature marvel. His locomotive is a monster compared to the early double Fairley. It weighs 62 tons, twice that of a Fairley engine, and has 3 times the tractive power. 2 separate power units come off the huge boiler, but being articulated, it can still manoeuvre the twists and turns easily. It leaves its older Welsh brother looking, well, fairly insignificant.
With the Fairley, the boiler sits on top of both bogies, but with the Garrett, the bogies are outside the boiler. The carrying frame carries the boiler. This means you can have a much bigger boiler. However, once you jam all this on a 2-foot gauge, it means you haven't got a lot of room for anything else. So visibility is terrible, which is why both the fireman and the driver have to keep a very careful lookout.
Keeping a lookout would be even harder going through a narrow cutting. But that's a small downside to an otherwise ingenious design. It was far heavier than the Fairley, but by evenly spreading the weight of the Garrett engine over 10 axles, the load at any one point is reduced. This is a massive advantage when you're running on light, narrow gauge lines.
At the front of the Garrett, you can see one of the secrets of its loading success, because the water's at the front, over the bogie, then you have the carrying frame, which holds the boiler, then the back bogie has the coal. The load is very evenly spread, so it can be carried on a 2-foot gauge. A standard class size locomotive, a big locomotive on a narrow railway. Very clever. That's really working now, as you start a real big ascent. Not for nothing, this is called the Welsh Highland Railway. Because of the engineering possibilities of narrow gauge lines and the refinements of engines like the Garrett, narrow gauge railways became the norm in hilly parts of the world.
The Garrett engine was one of the final major breakthroughs in narrow gauge steam design. And this mighty locomotive, which has powered its way across distant, rugged terrains, owes its existence to horse rails, miniature engines, and hills full of slate.
The technology developed by the little trains of Wales created the greatest network of narrow gauge mountain railways in the world. It's got the power they need, and with the bogies it can go round the corners. Fairly built an engine with big ideas. This is stalled. Toot toot.